This madness all happened about 20 years ago. I've never talked about it. No one else would believe it. I don't blame you if you don't either. Sure, I wouldn't. My brother Steve and I had gotten permission from our parents to fly out to British Columbia by ourselves to see our cousin Denise and my Aunt Victoria. My brother was 18, I was 15. We were out on the west coast visiting with them, and they suggested we could go out to spend the night with a friend of theirs named Blake. He lived in a float house, my cousin Denise said to us. Their friend was a retired professional chef and maintained a peaceful existence far away from any civilization. His floating cabin was anchored in a bay which sheltered his abode from the harsh weather and waves of the Pacific Ocean. The place was accessible only by prop plane or by boat. It took us hours to get out there, but the area was idyllic and breathtaking in its beauty, so the trip there was certainly not boring. Vast wilderness as far as the eye could see, blue oceans and mountains on the horizon. The weather was warm but rainy, despite the fact that it was late winter. There was rarely snow in that part of the province, as we were used to back home. On our trip out to the floating house, we stayed near land for safety in our small vessel. It also afforded a few looks at some of the sights along the way. Giant, towering waterfalls, huge cliffs, as well as wildlife of all sorts. Orca whales, dolphins, seals, and sea lions were spotted along the way. At one point, we saw an eagle in the water up ahead. My cousin Denise was up front, and her husband Jack was driving the boat inside his little glass hut near the back. She waved for him to slow down as we approached the huge dinosaur bird swimming in the water. It looked injured, we thought at first. My cousin tried to reach out to it with a pole to help it up into the boat, but she just scared it off and it flew away. We realized the giant bird wasn't injured at all. It was carrying a fish in its talons. The bloated carcass of the thing bobbed to the surface, and my cousin pulled it up from the water as the bald eagle watched enviously from its perch on a tree nearby. The strange fish was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was an odd shade of purple, and was clearly dead. There was a hole in its middle from where the bird had impaled it with its talons, using its giant clawed feet to drag the thing up to shore. Jack came up front to look at the fish. Never seen one like that before. Looks like a bottom feeder. I wonder how that eagle managed to grab it. He told us to leave it where it was and got back behind the wheel. He drove close to the shore and came back to the front of the boat. He heaved the fish onto the shore, and we watched as the bald eagle swooped down from its high tree branch to feast on it. It pulled the flesh from the thing in large strips, gulping them down greedily. It would have felt bad if we scared him off from his breakfast, Jack said, going back into his glass hut where the steering wheel was kept. The boat started moving again, and we watched the trees go by as the never-ending forest continued to pass on our left. Finally, we reached the small bay where the float house was located. The quiet inlet was the perfect spot for a solitary life. My cousin's friend Blake greeted us with a big smile when we pulled up, throwing out ropes for us to tie off with. It appeared he hadn't seen any other people for a long time, and he was jovial and talkative for long stretches. Bonjour! He tied up the ropes quickly with expert precision and held out a hand for my cousin Denise. She climbed off the boat and they embraced warmly. Les amis, et approchez. Bienvenue dans la maison flottante de Blake. Hello, friends and loved ones. Welcome to the floating house of Blake. I figured it was something like that based on what I remembered from my 9 years of mandatory French class, courtesy of the Canadian school system. Ah, you must be the cousins, he said to us, extending a hand when we were safely off the boat. Welcome to my humble abode. He shook his hand and smiled back at him. Thankful he was speaking English now. My brain was fuzzy enough from jet lag without having to translate with my D+ grade 9 French class education. Thanks for having us. This place is amazing. I can't believe you live out here, I said. I'm just lucky, he said. Some people couldn't do it, since it can be a little lonely sometimes, but personally, I love it. He took us for a tour of his little house. It took about a minute. A bedroom, a living room, a kitchen, a bathroom that we weren't supposed to use. My cousin's husband told me if I had to go, just to hang my butt off the side and let her rip into the ocean. Just make sure someone's watching in case you fall in. Blake was more excited to take us for a tour of the bay and the surrounding area. He had prawn traps placed nearby, and there were oysters galore wherever you looked. You could cast out a fishing line anywhere and catch a cod. For someone like me who enjoyed the outdoors and loved to fish, this was paradise. The bay was just as inviting for aquatic life as it was for humans, it seemed. The quiet waters made for excellent fishing. We pulled up a giant cod that was about 3 feet long without even trying that hard. And that was after grabbing dozens of oysters and hundreds of prawns in less than an hour with barely any effort. Blake set the traps back for the next day and said we would be having an all-you-can-eat buffet of them for as long as we stayed. It was exciting to help pull up the prawn traps, seeing their beady red eyes as hundreds of them squirmed in the traps. It made me hungry just looking at them. "You can eat them raw, you know," Blake said, grabbing one and biting it in half. "They taste sweet." He handed me one and I followed suit. They did taste sweet, I thought to myself. And a little salty, of course. "Dinner will be in a few minutes," Blake said from the kitchen. It was a couple hours after we had gotten back from pulling up prawn traps. He was preparing a feast, which would prove to be very tasty. Fresh prawns sautéed in garlic, scallops and clams served with rice were all on the menu. There were also vegetables, but I won't bore you with the details of those. The aroma was mouth-watering. "That smells amazing," I said to him. "Can't wait to try whatever you have baking in the oven." "Oysters Rockefeller," he called back from the kitchen. I never heard of it, but I was in for whatever the hell that was. I watched as he pulled a steaming baking tray from the oven. The smell of melted cheese and toasted breadcrumbs wafted over, making me salivate even more. "What are we going to do with that cod?" my cousin Denise asked. "Doesn't seem like we need it for dinner," Blake said. "I was thinking we could use it to try to catch an even bigger one tomorrow." "Bigger than that one?" I exclaimed. "How big do these things get?" "About 5 feet. Some of the biggest ones I've seen," Blake said. I couldn't believe that something so big could be used as bait. But whatever was going to consume that creature had to be massive. I really wanted to see if it worked. "Can we go out after dinner?" I asked, excitedly. I'd been fishing in freshwater lakes and rivers for most of my life, and this was something new and different. I was amazed at the variety of ocean life and how this man was living happily from its bounty. "Yeah, we can do that," he said with a smile, happy to oblige. I really wish Blake had said no, though. I wish he'd said not tonight, looking back. But he agreed. And with that, our lives would be changed forever. We climbed into the boat as the sun was beginning to set on the horizon. Blake had a big spotlight up front and said that we would need to be extra careful to watch out for deadheads. If you don't know, those are branches and logs that poke out from the water and can damage the boat when you're too close. They're easy to spot in broad daylight, but at night you can figure out pretty quickly how they got their name. If you're speeding along in a motorboat and you clip a big deadhead, you're not going to be looking very pretty after that. I promised to keep a lookout, and we left the float house, looking for deeper waters. The water was cast in an orange glow, and I remember what Jack had said to us that morning as the sun came up. It was a strange Martian red as we were leaving the docks. "Red sky at night, sailors' delight. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning. I guess we better look out for trouble today, everyone," he had said, chuckling. But it was still an unsettling omen. The setting sun grew dimmer as we made our way into deeper waters. We finally stopped in a seemingly random place that Blake told us had excellent fishing. We cast out our lines and bobbed the rods dutifully up and down as he had instructed us to earlier. We sat out there for an hour, with hardly a nibble. The sky went black as the moonless night began to glitter with a trillion stars. Then suddenly my line bent at an insane angle, and I felt myself being pulled across the steel floor of the boat. It all happened in an instant. Before I knew what was happening, I was flying off the side of the vessel and into the pitch-black water of the ocean. My instinct had been to hold on to the fishing rod, thinking it had been a large cod or some other creature taking the bait, but my ironclad grip on the handle seemed to tighten reflexively as I tumbled into the water. It was only when I felt the icy cold ocean on my skin that I let go, realizing how stupid I was for hanging on as long as I had. Part of me had been worried about losing the expensive fishing rod, but still, looking back, it was really idiotic. I kicked and thrashed in the cold water, my body nearly going into shock. Denise and Steve helped me up, and Blake ran over to help. Just as I was about to clamber over the railing and back into the boat, something grabbed onto my leg. It felt like it was an enormous hand made of mud. I looked back and saw a form was floating on the surface of the water. It was an amorphous blob that made itself into a more human form before my eyes. It clung on to my leg as it floated unnaturally in the water below me, and it felt like my foot was caught in quicksand. I screamed in terror and revulsion, kicking at the thing with my other leg, and my other foot sunk into its neck, and I felt myself being pulled into it. The thing made a sound like mud sucking out your shoes as you walk through it, over and over with greedy abandon pulling me into itself. I saw it was smiling, rows and rows of sharp teeth glistening in the moonlight. Its tongue poked out and licked my leg, and I saw it begin to hiss and steam as if acid had just been dropped onto it. I cried out in pain and fear as I grabbed onto my cousin and my brother. Blake grabbed me by my belt and heaved as hard as he could, trying to separate me from the thing. All the while, I looked into its eyes and saw they were yellow and full of hate and hunger. It made a deep growling noise from deep within itself when it saw me looking in its eyes. Suddenly, its sharp-toothed mouth opened like a shark, and it looked like it was going to take a bite out of me. That was when I heard the sound of a flare gun blast. I saw a sizzling firecracker burrowing a hole in the side of the thing's head, and Jack stood triumphantly on the deck of the boat with the orange flare gun in his hand. He ran over to help pull me in a second later as the thing began to loosen its grip. It wailed and writhed in pain. The feeling of being trapped in quicksand began to abate. Finally, they pulled me over the side into the boat. I breathed deep, gasping breaths and looked around in wild-eyed terror. Where had the thing gone? And then I saw it, standing behind Jack. It was like it had swam beneath the boat in an instant and clambered up the other side of the boat without the least bit of effort. Jack didn't notice it, of course. He was trembling, saying something about how he had never seen anything like that in his life, and it was lucky he had the flare gun handy. Then he noticed our widening eyes and looks of petrified horror. He turned around and I saw water pooling around his feet a second later as his bladder released. The thing stood 12 feet tall at least and as wide as a bear. It towered over him and picked him up with its huge arms. The creature appeared to be made of pitch-black mud, but it had a vaguely humanoid shape. It ripped his arms off first, then pulled off his head, cutting off his screams. The thing separated his legs from his body next and dropped them to the floor of the boat. It started with his head, eating it first and licking its bright red lips happily afterwards. The yellow-eyed creature picked up each part of him and swallowed Jack in great, big bites until there was nothing left of him. The black mud thing let out a loud and satisfied belch before smiling at us broadly again. And then it was gone as fast as it appeared, slipping off the side of the boat effortlessly, tipping the boat in that direction only slightly as it went, as if it was much lighter than it looked. We stood on the deck of the boat and looked at the chunks of hair and bits of bone, teeth and scraps of clothing that had belonged to our companion just a few moments before. My cousin Denise wept and banged her fists on the edge of the boat. We grabbed her and pulled her back as she almost dove into the water after the creature. She bawled and wailed, cursing and screaming at the thing. Blake drove us back to the float house after a few minutes of silent shock. We cleaned the boat and called in a report of a man overboard. giving the approximate location of where Jack had gone missing. But we knew nothing would ever be found when the police did their investigation. People fall into the ocean all the time, and many are never found, so the cops didn't give us too much trouble. The water had been cold that night, and Jack was not a good swimmer. We went back home a few days later. My brother and I were never the same after that. We had seen something that was unexplainable and irrational, and now we had no idea what else was really possible. I've never gone back to British Columbia. I can't go fishing anymore either. I used to love fishing. But the worst part is when it rains. When the ground turns soft and muddy. I can't go outdoors at all until it's dry again. I begin to panic if I get caught in a storm and have to walk through the muck, and if I feel it pulling at my shoes, grabbing me, and trying to take me down and into it. The worst part is I can't help but look, and he's always there looking right back. A smiling face with yellow eyes and too many teeth, staring back at me hungry, ravenous, and never satisfied.